Pivots and pins. There's a lot of variety with pivots and pins. It's not just three sticks connected together. The important part is how they connect. So the pivots here, these are titanium pivots, and you can tell because they're colorful, but most pivots are made of some form of steel. Titanium is softer than steel, so while this is nice and decorative, it is easier to strip the screws. Most pivot screws are T10. A T10 Torx bit. This is a Weeha Torx bit. They're very reliable and they're good. There's a little bit of magnetism at the end. And this is a T8. You can see that it's smaller. I'm not going to bother pointing it, but the T10 is bigger. If you're unlucky, some of them are T6, which is even smaller and unfortunately more likely to strip. Now, the parts of speaking of magnetic, the parts of a screw include, basically, you have, wow, this is tight. Come on. Here we go. You have the actual screw head. This is the screw. You have the pivot, which is this part here. I prefer my pivots, to have screw heads as well, but many of them, unfortunately, do not, such as this one. This one, you can see the pivots themselves don't have screws, but the screw heads do. Now, also, in a pivot system are washers. Most washers in Balisongs are phosphor bronze, which are bronze colored. Phosphor bronze are the standard because they're soft and cheap, but the biggest thing is that they get crushed. So usually when you have phosphor bronze washers and a Balisong, they get bound closer together so that they really stick in with the grooves of the bushings and the handles and the blade, and it all sits together neatly. However, if you disassemble your knife, a lot of times you typically need to actually just throw out those washers. While washers are very inexpensive, it can also just be a pain in the butt to maintain. And so essentially, because of how they're crushed, quite literally crushed, realigning that can kind of not always work. So also depending on how tight you really crank it down, it can affect different things. So washers unfortunately need to be thrown out, but some people have started to use stainless steel washers because they don't actually crush. If they're hardened, that is. Hardened stainless steel washers don't get crushed. What this does mean, though, is that it does apply some force to the handle because the handles are not stainless steel usually. They're usually aluminum or titanium, and so that means that they actually get some force push back. Some people worry because this can affect overall things over time, but as long as you keep it lubricated, it shouldn't be an issue, and as long as you're not like cranking it down to possibly even damage these handles. So it shouldn't be an issue. And so stainless steel washers do maintain their shape and you don't have to replace them. Of course, it costs extra. And unless you're buying a Machine-Wise knife, you're going to have to buy your own set. Just make sure that you keep them lubricated because while phosphor bronze washers don't need to be lubricated as often, you still need to lubricate them. Stainless steel washers demand more lubrication. And the last part of a lot of pivots is bushings. If you don't know what bushings are, that's okay. Bushings are these small steel rings, and they sit inside the blade's pivot hole. Now, if you have a bushings knife, not all knives are run on bushings, but if you do have a bushings knife, they sit in the pivot here. And this is the part that rotates. The washers keep it in place against. Washers actually do have a front and a back side. So you want the slightly curved side facing inward and the flat side facing towards the handles. So then you have it lined up like this. Sorry, that's hard to see. Like this. And then you stick the handle through. You usually push the washers out a little bit. Come on. And there we go. And then you put the pivot back in. there are some really helpful tools which I can go over in a different video when I talk about maintenance. And, geez. The bushings basically sit on the pivot, and the bushings rotate on the pivot. And so bushings are very popular because you can crank down the tune of your screws, and they will be very, very easy to swing. Now, the thing about bushings, though, is that they're more expensive because in order to get good bushings, you have to tune them, usually by hand, and it's quite a process. It usually involves having sandpaper and putting it back on and taking it off, and just, it's a process. So bushings are more expensive, but it's the kind of the standard. I'm just testing to see which side is the screw and which side is the pivot. So this is the screw side. Yep. And so that way I like to have my pivots in the same direction instead of having them mismatch alignment. Normally I use a tool, but I seem to have left that in a different room, unless that is here. I'm just using, you don't need the Indiana John pivot needle, but I'll get to that in the maintenance video. You just kind of have to wiggle it in if you don't have it, which is why I prefer having the tool. Now, some Balisongs use only washers. Some of them are metal, but basically plastic ones are only washers. Washers only Balisongs function and feel similar to bushings. However, if you crank them, you crank the screws too much, then you get what is called binding. Binding is when your handles just don't fall the way. I'm going to make another video also about typical issues and what it's called, what they're all called, and what they all mean. I'm just going to do this another time. So some Balisongs are also on bearings, which are little ball bearings. As you can see, just taking out as a pain in the butt. Ball bearings actually feel quite different. They're usually more kinetic in that they carry momentum a lot more, and well, some people just don't like how they feel. They're just different from bushings. Bushings give you more control, and bearings are a lot more dependent on where the momentum of things are going. I also find that bearings give heavier knives a lot more mobility and agility. So I find that if a knife is over 5 ounces, then you might find them with bearings. And if they're with bushings, it can actually feel sometimes a little sluggish depending. So it's not one is better than the other. It's usually just that it's a preference. There are also different kinds of bearings. Like there's caged ceramic bearings, which I feel like is a nice middle ground between bushings and bearings. But steel bearings are the typical ones where you'll find that on like a Balisong Z. Now, the other thing I want to talk about are pins. Zen pins are where you have them in here. These are press fit Zen pins. Press fit Zen pins are literally you just have a metal piece that's just pushed through and it's stuck in there. Some of them are screwed in, so you have to maintain them with tightening the screws. But the tightness of these screws also affects sometimes the tolerances, whether or not it will bind or if there's play or anything. So that can be a fun thing. And then oftentimes in sandwich ones, you will have hidden Zen pins. So you can't actually see it out here, but there is a Zen pin in here. And the Zen pin is what makes contact with the Zen nipple, which is this bottom part here of the blade. Sometimes they're not very prominent or they're just very curved. Sometimes they're a very distinct pokey bit. And the Zen nipple makes contact with the Zen pin, and that's what stops it. Because without a Zen pin, these handles would slap together, or the handle here, when instead of stopping here, could go even further. You could just go that way. The alternative to Zen pin, typically, is Tang pins. The Tang is what's here. This is the Tang of the blade. Tang pins, you usually have one here and one on the Zen, and instead of having pins in the handle, they're on the blade, and they make contact with the grooves in the handle. Now, some people find that Tang pins don't maintain tolerances as well. one tricky thing about Zen pins, or about Tang pins, I should say, Tang pins, if they get damaged, are much, much harder to repair. And the Nautilus, which is a knife known for being on Tang pins, the version 1 Nautilus had issues where essentially the pins would degrade. And so the knife would then slap together. So this handle gap here, it would make contact, and that was not great for the knife. These Tang pins, thankfully, are really thick, so I'm not very worried about that at all. But Zen pins are replaceable and are fixable. It's just a matter of how the knife is constructed. One thing I do notice also about Tang pins is that it does make whip rollovers a little hard. You can't really do that in slow motion, but you're supposed to roll over like this. Because it's so prominent up here, whip rollovers are a little tricky. Now, the third the third pin system is pinsless. Here, there's no real Zen nipple. There's no Tang pins. This is a pinsless design, and what that means is that in the handle, there are these areas here that make contact with the back of the blade. It's kind of divoted inwards, actually, so that it makes contact like this. You don't need to have a divot in here. This is also a pinsless design because there are no Tang pins, there's no Zen pins. Now, what that means is on plastic, it's not usually a big deal because it's so light that I don't have to worry about the degradation. But when you have titanium handles making contact with steel blade, the titanium can degrade, which means that over time, pinsless knives will lose their shape. And so this handle gap will get smaller over time if I were to swing this knife a lot, and if I were to beat this knife and flip it just a lot. It's just how it's going to be. You usually have a steel blade make contact against a steel pin, and those are typically strong enough and dense enough that they will maintain their shape. But when you have titanium against steel, the titanium is softer. There are also knives like the Swordfish and the Kuno. The Swordfish is an aluminum blade and aluminum handles and pinsless. And the Kuno is titanium blade, titanium handles, which means that they're like-unlike contacts. So one's not going to necessarily beat the other out, but they will both slowly wear each other over time because they're also softer than steel. So while pinsless is a very cool design, it is not without its risks. So the standard typically is bushings and Zen pins. I prefer press fit Zen pins or hidden Zen pins just because screws, again, they can affect tolerances. I find that this particular knife, the screws are very easily fall out. And depending on how tight they are, it can cause binding. So that's basically the short and sweet of pins and pivots. So if you like this, I hope that you found this helpful. Check out the coffee in my description. It helps me make these videos. And I'll see you in the next introduction video.